You're listening to 4CRB's interviews and talkback series.
I'd like to welcome to the microphone Supreme Court Judge David Ashton Lewis.
Oh, thank you, Colin. Thank you for inviting me, as always. And I hope it's not too hot for all our listeners out there, because it's quite warm. So I want to say good morning to all those who listen to us and like us, and to Lynn and Somerset. Good morning to you both and everyone else.
All right, well, nice of you to say good morning to everybody, David. And on the flip side of the coin,
yes.
We've had an election recently, and I did mention that we were going to be covering a number of topics this morning. So we thought we'd start there, and I'll ask you to give us your views.
Well, isn't it good? Because whether you're a diehard Labor voter, a Green or an Independent or Liberal National Party, what we saw happen on Saturday was one of the fundamental strengths, but one of the most annoying aspects of that fundamental strength is the right to choose. And the Labor government left office, didn't sort of want to stay, said, no, we accept the will of the people. I didn't hear it, but I've had a number of people speak to me since Saturday about a not very good conceding speech by Stephen Miles on Saturday night. Now, I didn't hear it, so we're all different. We'll all take a defeat in one way. That really is irrelevant. You can make up your mind about Stephen Miles and a man. What the big thing is, the majority of the Queensland people said it's time for a change.
That's right. Yeah. And look, it was an interesting lead-up. I noted that a lot of people voted early. I must admit I heard a lot of conversation about assisted dying and anti-abortion laws, or abortion laws, my apologies. So, and a lot from the younger demographic, which is nice to hear them being engaged.
And being involved.
Because normally it's, for goodness sake, they just waffle on and don't don't do anything, or they don't really relate to us.
Yes.
So, look, it was nice to hear that. I'll be honest, I actually thought that it'd go the other way due to the amount of conversation I'd heard about assisted dying and abortion. But, you know, the Queensland public have voted for change, and hopefully they can deliver those changes.
Well, that's always the challenge. Now, one of the difficulties in the strength of liberal parliamentary democracy is, again, we've talked on this, how many people here have gone up to Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne and seen a tank parked at the corner of a street, or soldiers standing there with submachine guns over their shoulder. You never have seen it.
No.
So that's one of the benefits of our democratic system. But there's negatives in it, because what a person or a party can say in opposition is there's constraints when they are given the Treasury benches and the Treasury amounts, that what they can really do. Now, Mr. Premier Crisafulli was very clear on a number of things. So really it's a waiting game now, isn't it, to see?
It is.
And of course, assisted dying and abortion is always a hot topic. There will be those who will take one side of that and say anything other than our side is wrong. Then you'll get on the other side who will say, no, our side is correct.
Look, we have laws that allow both in Queensland, and they've been here for a little while now, and they've been accepted. I think that I don't see rioting in the streets.
No.
I don't see any adverse issues on society or our culture.
Yes.
So, to be honest with you, I really don't understand the big rev up. I can see the religious component.
Yes.
I truly can. But again, I always fall back to that same old idiom, and we've talked about this off air, David. Who is it actually affecting? Me choosing to pass away early because I have motor neuron disease is only really affecting me.
Well, I think so.
And if I am a believer, well, the Lord will judge me as I go through the gates.
Yes.
And if I'm not, well, he may very well do the same thing when I get there and go, oh, goodness gracious me, I had it wrong.
Or you may just die and there's blackness.
There may be.
You have no knowledge of anything. So that's what my father said to me, that he didn't fear being killed fighting the Japanese. He said most of us didn't, because if you're killed, you're dead.
Sure.
So either you're going to find out there is something or there's nothing. They all were afraid of being badly wounded in the hothouse of the South Pacific jungles. And I think it's like anything. And one of the hardest things in a democratic society is we are allowed our opinion. We are allowed to express it. And so it's not far jump that if you believe in something and you meet someone who believes in totally the opposite, that very hard to ignore and say, well, let's just, you believe in this, I believe in that.
Let's agree to disagree.
Yes, let's agree. Because we are passionate creatures, human beings, and if you spend time, you come to conclusions and think, yes. But you can't lose respect, and you mustn't lose respect for someone who says, no, I don't accept any of that.
No, that's correct. So moving on from that,
Yes.
I'll be honest, changing of the law to potentially combat youth crime, very welcome. I didn't see anything on energy policy, unfortunately, from either side of the fence, and I think that's a big deal. Continually giving people money to solve their bill problem is not fixing the problem in the long term, and that is something that we absolutely need to do. We've known this problem's been coming since the 80s, and we've done nothing about it.
But really, that's a federal domain, that. States can do a little bit.
Sure.
But if the feds can't get all 6 states and territories agreeing, it hamstrings the federals. So the federals are able really to say, this is what's going to happen.
And that's a good thing, David, if you can go down to explaining that in a nutshell about the states and the federal government, because I did have a gentleman telling me that the federal government, we're over-governed, the federal government needs to take more of an active role, and I was explaining to him that they can't.
No.
And David, I'll let you explain the nuances.
Yes, we have talked about this. We are a federated commonwealth. Now, by that I mean the Commonwealth of Australia came into being on January the 1st, 1901. From 1788 to 1900, we weren't Australia. We were 6 independent, if you like, countries with their own governments. There was the government of Queensland, the government of Victoria. They all had Queen Victoria as the head of state, but they all were self-governing. And
individual armies,
individual
police forces.
Well, I've just bought a book this morning on Breaker Morant, and of course he was in what was known as the Bushveld Carbineers, and they were primarily Victorians. And so I'm interested to read it only because when I was 8, 7, 6, I had an aunt and uncle. They had properties, but my aunt wanted to live in Bendigo because she didn't like being out isolated on the farm. So my uncle bought this lovely home in Bendigo, and I would go there. She was my father's second oldest sister, and we'd stay there, and I'd be out in the front garden either watering, because it was usually summer and extremely hot, and this old man would walk past, and he'd look and he'd say, "G'day, young fella." And I'd say, "Oh, good morning." And my aunt said, "That man's name is George Whitten, Mr. Whitten." "Oh, yes," said I. And she said, he was one of the 3 men, along with Breaker Morant, Peter Hancock, and George Whitten. They were all lieutenants in the Bushveld Carbineers, and they were arrested in 1901 as the Boer War was coming to an end and charged with murder, because it looks like it was really Peter Hancock who shot a German missionary who there was severe questions that he was in fact leaking the English side of intelligence to the Boers. And, oh yeah, right, I said, my father had spoken about the Boer War.
Funny, isn't it?
And this particular uncle, who was a sniper on the Western Front in the First World War, he had a friend who was also on the Western Front but also fought in the Boer War. He was older. And anyway, I heard the story, and my aunt said, well, that Mr. Whitten, and he was, oh golly, this would have been 1957, so he was probably 80 then, that he was the George Whitten, 19-year-old lieutenant, who got court-martialed, sentenced to death. The two older ones were shot, but the government intervened. The government of Victoria petitioned, and he was released. Came back to Australia, and she said, you must never talk about it. Well, I didn't have to, because Mr. Whitten, one day going past, said, I hope, did your father fight in the war? Because he knew this Uncle Bill had been a sniper on the Western Front. And he said, let me tell you, young fella, you never ever want to go to war. I was 19 when I went to war. And I said, oh, Mr. Whitten, I've been told that you were one of Breaker Morant's. And he said, I was. But I was spared because I was 19. So I then stepped up in courage and said, it causes such dispute. Were you all innocent? And he said, well, I didn't shoot anyone, and neither did Breaker Morant. Mr. Lieutenant Hancock, possibly, but they were not death. He shot what was believed to be a spy. And yet the British wanted to make, there was a book written called Scapegoats of the Empire, and he said, we were scapegoats. And he said, I've lived with it all my life. And he said, it's enough to say, don't ever fight in a war.
So coming back to the Federated States.
Well, that federated, see, there's an example. Between 1889, and I've said this, between 1889 and 1900, there were a number of conventions, primarily in Sydney and Melbourne, where each of those countries sent delegates, and they argued back and forth. Do we be like the Americans? We give up certain rights as independent countries to a central government, which the Americans did. Their 13 colonies then became the United States, or do we remain independent? Now, ultimately, and the argument for banding together was, we're all of Anglo-Saxon descent, we all speak English, and Queen Victoria is the head of all of this. At that stage, Australia had about 1.9 million people throughout the Commonwealth. And the big argument was, big landmass, we should band together. So ultimately the decision was made to band together. And that was one of the things that pushed New Zealand out of these conferences. New Zealand was in, and it was going to be part of the Commonwealth of Australia, this new country. Now the Kiwis said, look, the water that divides us is bigger than what divides Tasmania from it. So ultimately, these little countries decided to step back certain things like banking, marriage and divorce laws, bills of exchange acts, and certainly defence and foreign affairs, and said, we're going to give all that to a new central government. And you've heard me say it, and I've said it when I speak, that we primarily have two identities. You are Colin Balevsky, an Australian, but you are also Colin Balevsky, a Queenslander. And certain laws apply to you that when you cross that border into New South Wales, they no longer restrict you, because you're bound by New South Wales
and
law.
As we saw in COVID, which is probably a really good example,
yes.
Every state was able to handle it their own way.
Yes, now that's where, I've been interested, and I want to get my hands on the report, because I felt that the state should have been pulled into line. And I noticed that the report particularly points out and criticises the West Australian Premier, I've forgotten his name, Anastasia Palaszczuk, for shutting the border, And there was another, Daniel Andrews. Now, one of the problems also because I believe fundamental human rights were abused and freedom of movement was abused. Now, a government does have the power to limit movement in times of extreme danger, all right? You had this. But when I heard, and I've mentioned this before on this show, when Anastasia Palaszczuk was suffering real bad criticism for following now our governor, but then Janet Young's advice on health. Remember that little 3-year-old boy who could not come back into Queensland, and he was really wanting to be with his mum and dad, and mum and dad couldn't go down into New South Wales and get him. Now, when I heard Anastasia Palaszczuk she was grilled by the press on this, she said, look, what can I do? I am bound by the advice of Dr. Young. Now, she was the chief health officer, and she wasn't bound. She had the power to say, thank you, Dr. Young, you are very senior, but I'm the ultimate decision maker. In other words, she abdicated her constitutional power as the head of government here. And they all did. All the premiers did, and particularly Victoria, Western Australia. So I hope it's like anything. It's the first thing that's happened since the Second World War. I hope we learn from it.
And I think that's the point, David. It's very easy to go back and blame and point fingers and say, weren't they terrible? They did the best they can at the time.
They did.
We do need clearer guidelines about something like this happening. I did see that one of the recommendations is a CDC-type centralised component that advises all of the states as well as the federal government as to how best to handle things going forward.
Well, see, this is one where I apologise for cutting you off, but this is one where I believe, and many other constitutional judges would be totally against me on this. Others will be for. But I believe in things like that. Only one authority must control it. That's the federal government, and state premiers will do what they are told. It happened in the Second World War when the feds asked, because up until 1942, income tax was a state domain.
Let's just stand back for a moment, wipe away the bureaucracy, wipe away what's coming before us, and say, if we actually looked at the country as it is today and go, what is the optimum way of doing things? What is the most efficient? What is the best way of doing anything? Centralising a police force, centralising a defence force, centralising the medical system and the ambulance system, all makes a great deal of sense. It gets rid of a lot of replication.
Yes.
Same with social services, all of those sort of things. Yes. But it's very difficult to ask a state government to relinquish power when,
they're on the ground. Look at the youth crime problem.
Sure.
What on earth does Hobart have to do with Queensland, Gold Coast youth crime?
Sure.
And I'm sure they've got their own down there. It appears to be a malaise throughout the Commonwealth, and we've talked on this, and we haven't got time now, but it raises the question of, the responsibility of society to return or renew or reinvigorate social respect.
And look, that's a big one, because it only really cracked the thought for me. And I get it. You can sit there and say it's the parents' responsibility. This starts at home. But until you paint the picture that if the laws are antiquated or tightened enough that, what is the percentage? 10% of people are in jail, 20%, 50%, 60%. If 60% of people are in jail for the fact that they run on the wrong side of the law, we do actually have to look at ourselves as a society. We do actually have to look at where we're running foul of things and introduce those thoughts and ideals and ethics into people, right?
What you're setting up
is
that the answer to something like youth crime and many other things is a whole of society. It starts at home. It starts with the society so parents who may be not doing what's expected feel ashamed because all of society is not as slack as you are, and your children are slack because you're slack. So it really starts with society.
Sure.
It starts then with elected representatives passing laws that reflect society's needs. It then starts with judges applying those laws, and they've got discretion, and it then goes to mum and dad, what are you doing about this?
Sure.
So I feel uncomfortable with just blaming one. I think
do too.
the blame is on all of us.
And then the second component that you'll get is, well, it takes both parents to go out and work full-time. In some households, they're holding down 2 jobs each.
Yes.
So where is the time to actually spend with the children and give them guidance? They're getting their guidance from YouTube. They're getting their guidance from social media. And unfortunately, that could be the heart of the problem.
And that's why we can't just look. Look, I would get up in the morning, I would say goodbye to my mother and go to school. When I came home, she was there with a piece of cake or a biscuit, and I'd have that, get out of my school uniform and go and either do homework or go and play cricket up in the park. And then when I'd get home, she was there with a meal ready. Now, that was lovely for my generation. I had good parents. I knew that I had a safe home. But look, there's always been examples of people that don't have that.
Sure.
So I think we talked about it once. There are some, look at Mr. Crisafulli. You do the crime, you do the time. So that's fine in some cases. So they do it. But in other cases, it might be appropriate for the same crime for a judge to say to a young person, I'm going to sentence you, but I'm going to wholly suspend that sentence. So you won't be going to prison. You won't be denied your freedom of movement. But if you make a mistake again, like the people who've been on bail 30 times and still committing offences, a judge can say, if you make a mistake again of a similar offence, then you're going to do 2 years in prison plus whatever else you've been brought back in front of me for. And then there'll be a third one where a judge will, all the same crime, but a judge will look and say, I accept that you come from a good background and you made a mistake. So I'm not even going to proceed to convict you. I'm going to release you now and say, I don't ever want to see your face again.
Yes.
Now, I did this a couple of times, and I had young people stand up in front of me and say, I never want to go through that again, sir. And I said, well, don't. And they never came back.
It's funny. It's a different ideology nowadays, I find, most often. We find that we get a lot of... In my day, I was afraid of the police. I didn't want to fall out of favour. I didn't want to get caught. No. I didn't want to do anything wrong for the fact that I didn't want to embarrass my family, myself, or anything that was going on there. As plus, I didn't want to
Well, did it ever cross your mind to look at a police officer who'd pulled you up and you said, now I can't use the language that's being used, but said, you jump in the lake, I don't have to do what you say?
That's right.
Did it ever cross your mind to say that to a policeman?
No, look, I grew up in the day where there was the rumour, and I'm not saying that it actually happened, of the telephone books and the baton.
Oh, I know it happened because I was involved. It was a particular police station in the leafy laned eastern suburbs of Melbourne, because one Saturday morning, my cousin and I were 17, we were walking the dogs, and next minute a divvy wagon pulls up beside us and says, 2 policemen get out, you 2 young men, get in the back of this vehicle. And we said, what for? And the policeman said, highway patrolman said, it's not your place to ask questions. And I said, well, what about the dogs? They can get in the back as well. We ended up down at this police station in a room, and the detectives told us, if you don't answer the questions that we're going to ask you, see those 2 chairs in the middle of the room? Have you ever been hit on the head with a phone book on your head and a nightstick? And we said, no. And said, it sends a shock right down your spine. And I said, am I allowed to call my father? And they said, yes, you can. So I went and called Dad. About half an hour later, I hear my father's voice outside and saying, what have you charged these 2 with? And they said, we haven't charged them. So Dad was smart. He said, either you charge them now or you release them into my custody. So these rather grumpy detectives came and said, you two smart Alex, get out of here.
There you go. All right, David, we're getting towards the end of the program. I'm going to get you to sum up. We've wandered all over the page today, haven't we?
But we've wandered on topics that are just the challenges, one, of a free and democratic society where you're free to disagree. And we've seen that there are, for all the benefits of a free and democratic society, there are also difficulties. But I think if you said to anyone, so would you like to be like Xi Jinping's China? One party, you do what you're told. Or Mr. Putin's Russia, we would be the first to say absolutely not. So we have to keep our heads sensible, we have to keep our heads fair, and we have to be willing to be wrong.
Indeed we do. And turn the television off is probably one of my tips at the moment. We're in day 3 of Anthony Albanese took a upgrade, and I'm at a point where, for goodness sake, we've moved off the Labor Party because the Liberals are in Queensland. Now we're attacking the Federal Labor Party. How about some even-handedness?
Yes.
Please.
Look, I agree. I agree. He's the Prime Minister of Australia, and he's entitled to upgrades. Even if there's 100 of them, he's entitled to them. So, on that note, would all the lovely listeners out there, my son Somerset Lynn, cogitate these things over the coming week, and we shall meet again next Thursday.
David Ashton-Lewis, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been listening to 4CRB's Interviews and Talkback series. Support local online content and become a financial supporter today at 4crb.com.